I never believed in the small things until Marcus taught me to notice them. You know how sometimes you go through life on autopilot, barely registering the 1,000 tiny gestures that make up a day? That was me. Until one Thursday night in November, when I fell asleep on our ratty couch watching some documentary about ocean currents, and I woke up at 3 in the morning, covered by a blanket I definitely didn't put there. Not just draped over me either, tucked in. Like, carefully tucked in at the edges, the way your mom might have done when you were 7 years old and couldn't sleep. I lay there in the dark for probably 20 minutes, just processing it. The apartment was silent, except for the radiator making its usual clanking sounds. Marcus's bedroom door was closed, a thin line of light visible underneath. He was probably still up, reading one of those thick fantasy novels he always had going. The blanket was the good one too, the fleece throw he usually kept on his bed, not the scratchy wool thing we kept on the couch. My phone had fallen between the cushions, and when I fished it out, I saw it was plugged in. I hadn't done that either. Marcus had moved in 6 months ago, answering my Craigslist ad for a roommate after my ex moved out and left me scrambling to cover rent on our place. I'd been skeptical when this tall, quiet guy with dark curly hair and these really intense brown eyes showed up at my door. He was almost too put together, you know? Like, he had his life figured out in a way that made me feel like I was still playing catch-up at 28. But he'd paid first and last month up front, said he was a freelance graphic designer who mostly worked from home, and honestly, I was desperate. The first few months were fine, polite. We did the roommate dance of learning each other's schedules, who took out the trash when whether it was okay to eat each other's leftovers if you asked first. Marcus was tidy, paid bills on time, and had this habit of leaving little notes on the fridge. Not passive-aggressive ones, just helpful stuff. Picked up milk, receipt on counter if you want to split it. Or, running dishwasher tonight, add your stuff if you want. It was considerate in a way that felt almost old-fashioned. But that blanket thing, that changed something in me. I started noticing other things after that. How when I'd mention offhand that I was craving something, like Thai food or those specific chocolate chip cookies from the bakery on 5th, it would just appear in the kitchen within a day or two. How he'd text me if it looked like rain and I'd left my windows open. How he always made extra coffee in the morning, even though he knew I rarely got up before 9, leaving it in the pot for me with a sticky note saying what time he'd brewed it, so I'd know if it was still good. I'm not an idiot. I knew what was happening to me, the way my heart started doing this stupid flutter thing when I'd hear his key in the lock at the end of the day, the way I found myself staying up later, hoping he'd come out of his room for a glass of water or a snack so we could talk. We'd started having these long conversations, the kind that drift from topic to topic, where you suddenly look up and realize it's 2 in the morning, and you've been talking for 4 hours about everything from childhood memories to what happens after we die, to whether robots could ever really be conscious. He had this way of listening that made you feel like every word you said mattered. He'd lean forward slightly, his elbows on his knees, and he'd nod at the right moments, ask follow-up questions that showed he was actually thinking about what you were saying. I'd catch myself talking about things I never told anyone, like how my dad left when I was 12 and I still had this recurring dream about him coming back, or how I'd almost gone to art school but chickened out at the last minute and went into accounting instead. And now I spent my days at a job that made me feel like I was slowly disappearing. Marcus never judged. He'd just listen, and then he'd share something equally vulnerable, like how he'd come out to his family at 19 and his mom hadn't spoken to him for 2 years, or how he sometimes felt like he was watching his own life from the outside, like he couldn't quite connect to it. Those conversations felt like finding water in a desert. I didn't realize how thirsty I'd been for that kind of connection, but I didn't know if he felt the same way about me. I mean, I'm pretty sure Marcus is gay. He'd mentioned an ex-boyfriend once, casual, when we were talking about bad breakups, but that didn't mean he was interested in me. I'm not exactly a catch. I'm average height, average build, with boring brown hair that never does what I want, and a tendency to overthink everything until I've talked myself out of whatever I was considering. I wear a lot of gray. My ex used to say I had all the personality of a tax form, which, given my profession, felt especially cutting. So I told myself the blanket thing was just Marcus being Marcus, thoughtful, kind. The sort of person who took care of people because that's who he was, not because he had feelings for me specifically. I tried to ignore the way my stomach twisted when I saw him in the morning, rumpled from sleep, wearing these old sweatpants and a t-shirt that had holes in it, his hair sticking up in every direction. Tried to ignore how I'd started timing my showers for when I knew he'd be in the kitchen so I could walk through in just a towel, hoping he'd look, feeling pathetic when I couldn't tell if he did. Then came the night of the office holiday party. I'd been dreading it for weeks, because these things were always awkward, full of forced cheer and people drinking too much and saying things they'd regret Monday morning. But it was mandatory, at least if you wanted to be seen as a team player, so I put on my one decent suit and headed out. It was every bit as bad as I'd expected. My boss cornered me for 20 minutes to talk about quarterly projections. Janet from HR had too much wine and started crying about her divorce. The guy from IT, who everyone knows is sleeping with the receptionist, kept giving me these weird, meaningful looks, like he wanted to confide something. By 9, I was ready to leave, but then my coworker Brad started buying shots, and I made the mistake of trying to keep up. I remember texting Marcus around 10:30, something like, "This party is killing me slowly. Send help or whiskey or both." He sent back a gif of someone playing a tiny violin, then added, "Want me to call with a fake emergency?" I told him I was fine. I'd be home soon. That was a lie. I was definitely not fine. The next clear memory I have is sitting on the curb outside the bar at midnight, trying to figure out how to call a lift when my phone seemed to have developed 3 screens. I must have texted Marcus again because suddenly he was there, pulling up in his beat-up Honda, wearing a jacket over his pajamas. He'd clearly been getting ready for bed. He still had toothpaste at the corner of his mouth. "Come on, lightweight," he said, but his voice was gentle, not mocking. He helped me into the passenger seat, reached across to buckle my seatbelt, and his face was so close to mine for a second that I could smell his shampoo, something clean and cedar-scented. I wanted to turn my head, close that tiny distance, but I was drunk, and he was doing me a favor, and I wasn't that guy, the one who made moves on people who were just being nice. The drive home is fuzzy. I remember leaning my head against the window, watching the streetlights blur past. I remember Marcus's hand on my shoulder, steadying me as we walked up the stairs to our 3rd-floor apartment because the elevator was broken again. I remember him getting me water, making me drink the whole glass, and then guiding me to my room. "Get some sleep," he said, and I grabbed his wrist without thinking. "Thank you," I said, "for coming to get me. You didn't have to." He looked at me for a long moment, and there was something in his expression I couldn't read. "Of course I did," he said quietly. "That's what friends do." Friends. Right. I let go of his wrist, and he left, closing the door softly behind him. I woke up the next morning feeling like death, with a pounding headache and a mouth that tasted like something had died in it. There was water and aspirin on my nightstand, along with a note in Marcus's handwriting. "Greasy breakfast food in the kitchen when you're ready to face the world. Take your time." I wanted to cry, but I blamed it on the hangover. We fell into this pattern after that. Not me getting drunk, but this dance of almost something that neither of us acknowledged. I'd catch him looking at me sometimes with this soft expression that made my chest ache. He'd find excuses to touch me, casual things like brushing past me in the kitchen or adjusting my collar before I left for work. We started having movie nights on Fridays, sitting on the couch with increasingly less space between us, until we were basically pressed together from shoulder to knee, sharing a bowl of popcorn. One night in early December, we were watching some action movie, and I fell asleep about halfway through. I'd been working late all week, stressed about year-end reports, barely sleeping. I woke up to the credits rolling, and Marcus still sitting next to me, his laptop open, working on some design project with the sound muted. The TV had gone to the screensaver. "Sorry," I mumbled, sitting up. "I'm terrible company." "You're fine," Marcus said, not looking up from his screen. "You needed the sleep." I started to get up, and that's when I realized there was a blanket over me, the fleece one from his room again, and it was tucked in, just like before, careful and deliberate at the edges. "You keep doing that," I said before I could stop myself. "Doing what?" He glanced over at me. "The blanket thing. Tucking me in." His cheeks went slightly pink. "Oh, sorry, is that weird? I can stop if it bothers you." "It doesn't bother me." I was still half asleep, my filter completely gone. "I like it. It makes me feel cared for." The words hung in the air between us. Marcus had gone very still, his eyes locked on mine. "You are," he said softly. "Cared for. Just so you know." My heart was hammering so hard I was sure he could hear it. "Marcus." "You don't have to say anything," he interrupted, looking away. "I know you probably don't. I mean, I'm not trying to make things weird. I just want you to know that you matter. To me, that's all." I should have been brave then. I should have told him that he mattered to me too, that I'd been half in love with him since probably the second month of living together, that every small kindness felt like a love letter I didn't know how to read. But I was scared of ruining our friendship, of making the apartment unbearably awkward, of wanting something I couldn't have. So instead I just said, "Thank you for everything." He nodded, gave me this sad little smile, and went back to his laptop. I went to bed feeling like I'd just made the biggest mistake of my life. Things shifted after that, not in a bad way exactly, but there was this tension now, this awareness. Marcus was still kind, still thoughtful, but he seemed more careful around me, like he was trying not to cross some invisible line. The blanket thing stopped. When I fell asleep on the couch now, I'd wake up cold. It felt like losing something precious. Christmas came and went. Marcus went home to visit his family, a trip he seemed nervous about. I spent the holiday with my mom and her new husband, feeling lonely in a room full of people. When Marcus got back, he seemed quieter, more withdrawn. I wanted to ask what happened, but I didn't know how without revealing how much I paid attention to his moods, how much I cared. Then came New Year's Eve. Neither of us had plans. We'd talked vaguely about going to some party one of my coworkers was throwing, but when the day came, we both admitted we'd rather stay in. We ordered pizza, bought fancy beer from the craft brewery down the street, and settled in to watch the ball drop on TV like a couple of old married people. As midnight approached, I felt this pressure building in my chest, like something had to give, had to change. We were sitting on opposite ends of the couch, more distance between us than there'd been in months, and it felt all wrong. "Can I ask you something?" Marcus said suddenly, during a commercial break. "Sure." He was picking at the label on his beer bottle, not looking at me. "That thing I said about you being cared for, did I make things weird?" "No," I said immediately. "Marcus, no, you didn't." "Then why do I feel like I did?" He finally looked up, and there was such vulnerability in his eyes that it hurt to see. "Why do I feel like I ruined something?" "You didn't ruin anything." I moved closer, closing some of that awful distance. "If anything, I ruined it by not being honest." "Honest about what?" On TV, they were counting down. 10, 9, 8. My heart was in my throat. About the fact that I notice everything you do for me. Every small thing. The coffee and the blankets. And the way you came to get me when I was drunk. The way you listen when I talk. The way you make me feel like I'm worth something. 7, 6, 5. "You are worth something," Marcus said fiercely. "You're worth everything." 4, 3, 2. "So are you," I whispered. And then it was midnight, and fireworks were exploding on the TV, and I was kissing him. Finally. His lips were soft, and he tasted like beer and hope. And when he kissed me back, his hand coming up to cup my face, I felt like I was falling and flying at the same time. We broke apart, breathing hard. The apartment was quiet, except for the distant sound of fireworks from outside. "I've wanted to do that for months," Marcus said, his forehead resting against mine. "Me too. I was just too scared." "Of what?" "Of this not being real, of you not feeling the same way, of being the kind of guy who falls for his roommate like some cliché." Marcus laughed, this soft, wonderful sound. "If you're a cliché, then so am I. I've been gone for you since you told me about your weird fear of butterflies." "It's not weird, they're unpredictable." He kissed me again, smiling against my mouth. "It's very weird, and very cute." We stayed up all night talking, but it was different now. His arm was around me, my head on his shoulder. We could touch freely, without pretense. He told me about tucking me in that first time, how he'd stood in the doorway of the living room for 5 minutes, trying to decide if it was crossing a line. How he'd been looking for excuses to take care of me ever since, hoping I'd notice, hoping I'd understand what he was too afraid to say directly. I told him about timing my showers and wearing my best shirts on days I knew he'd be home, and the way my heart raced every time I heard his key in the lock. We laughed at how oblivious we'd both been, how we'd been circling each other for months like idiots. "So what now?" I asked as dawn started to lighten the windows. "Now we stop being idiots," Marcus said simply. "Now we do this for real." "I'd like that." He pulled the fleece blanket off the back of the couch, the one he'd used to tuck me in so many times, and spread it over both of us. Then, deliberately, carefully, he tucked it in at the edges, just like always. "There," he said softly. "Perfect." And it was. It really was. Total_char_count, 16,847.